Welcome to Upstart Crow, a part of Watershed Lit Radio. Join us as we explore books and culture through engaging conversations with writers, historians, and creatives, offering unique insights into the literary arts and beyond. Hosted by Ken Budd, Jennifer DeSano, and William Miller. Now, here's the show.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to Upstart Crow. I'm your host, William Miller. My guest today is Mary Kay Zuravleff. We're focusing on her most recent novel, American Ending, which was inspired by the experiences of her grandparents. So we're discussing immigration, the work that immigrants do, novel craft, and also how to reach out to readers to create or build that community of people who share an experience through reading. Mary Kay, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Let's start with the dedication, if we might, because this is dedicated to your mother, your grandmothers, and yours. But what I want to start with is the part to your mother and your grandmothers. Why do you dedicate it that way?
Both sides of my family are from the same immigrant community. So many of them were born in America, but everybody traces their roots back to Suwalki, which is now Poland, but was Russia then. And everybody on both sides are members of this religion, the sect of Russian Orthodox called Starobratzi, the Old Believers. So you know how we talk a lot about, do you choose your topics or do your topics choose you as writers? And I had been working on this book for a while. And then, of course, you have to begin to get people to support your book, agents and editors. And I knew, of course, that I was named for my two grandmothers, Mary and Kay, and that's why I didn't answer to Mary. My mother trained me not to answer to Mary. But it wasn't until I was actually soliciting help for the book that I wrote that, oh my goodness, when my mother named me after Mary Zuravleff, who lost her citizenship for marrying my grandfather, and Kay Fedorov, who went into the mining company foreman's office and demanded that my grandfather be paid in cash rather than scrip, could she have known that I would be writing their stories? And I just got spooked all over again. So it just felt so predetermined to tell this story.
There's a lot of liveliness to your writing in this story. I mean, it begins, I hoped the sisters I'd never met would never join us. And when they did arrive, I wanted to send them back. That's how American I am.
I'm so glad you started there because that was hard won. And, you know, you of all people know how many drafts we go through and how many ways we try to give that first impression to the reader. And so people would read earlier drafts and Yelena, it's told from Yelena's point of view. She's 9 years old when the book begins. She's born in America. Her parents are not. They're brought over here by the coal company to mine coal in Appalachia. I combined both sides of my family to tell this story. And people would read a draft and they'd say, this charming immigrant child, she's not an immigrant. She's an American. And then also, when we talk to our students about what makes a novel, I had crafted it as she's 5, she's 7, she's 9, she's 11. But you need a conflict. People think that novels meander and find their way to a conflict, but they don't. In the first couple pages, it's all there. You give it all away right at the start. So how do you make somebody as American as possible? What is the most American thing people do? They want to close the door. Yeah. And so the conflict, the fear is that these sisters who they've left behind to come here are going to make the family Russian again. They're going to get over here, and now she's not going to be as American as she wants to be. So that was actually an editor who suggested that. I had started the book elsewhere, and she said, you know, I think it starts when she's worried about her sisters coming. And I had gotten a lot of advice, as you might imagine. Novelists get a lot of advice. And you have to know when you hear a good idea. So I had been through that beginning of many times. I had started in the old country with the grandparents coming, her parents coming over, because I really wanted to set that scene. But people really saw it as this immigrant story, and it is an immigrant story, but Yelena, your narrator, is born in America. And that's really important because it's her whole identity. She sees herself as an American, and the book is the challenge to that. So the editor said, I think you should start it there. And I called my mother, who had read many drafts, and she said she doesn't really believe in revision. And she said, I'm so sick of people telling you this book has been done. Oh, that's a good idea. I said, I know, it's a great idea. So you have to know when to take those.
Well, it becomes a very different novel when you start it there. I'm imagining what it would be if you started it in the old country with maybe an omniscient narrator or something like that, or even if you phased it, it would just be a very different book. I mean, here it is an historical novel, but it's not. You get such a strong presence of your narrator, Yelena, and she is clearly a feminist. She is clearly strong. She clearly emerges not only as a storyteller, but as a character. And I think it would be harder to bring her forward if you didn't start with that voice.
And it's 1908. So to say she's a feminist, is a really tricky thing because, boy, is she's all for her and she's all for the women in her family and herself. But one interviewer said to me, oh, I love how rebellious she is. She's not rebellious. She does every single thing that is expected of her. She's doing 100 million chores. She has to leave grade school to take care of her sister's babies because when they bring those girls over here, they marry them right off because it's 2 more mouths to feed. That's exactly what happened to my grandmother on my mother's side. She was born in America. They had left some girls behind because they only gave you tickets for yourself. The whole company's not going to bring your whole family over here unless they can work in the mines. And as soon as those girls were brought over, they thought it would be right away, but it was like 12 years later. As soon as they arrived, they married them off. And my grandmother had to leave 4th grade to take care of their babies. So anyway, the point is, Yelena does everything that's expected of her. The religion is unbelievably restrictive. It's a fundamentalist Christian religion. She does everything the church expects of her, but she's trying to figure out how within all of these rules am I going to get out of this mining town?
And I want to be clear because I think we will have some listeners who will not have read this novel. And I've been a fan of this novel since I first heard you read it at Fall for the Book. And I'm so glad to have this opportunity finally to get to talk to you about it. And we will reserve time at the end to talk about why we're talking about the novel today. But let's back up for a second. History versus the fictional world that you create. I mean, there really was this huge migration of Russians to the U.S. in this time period.
Absolutely. And the mining town that both sets of my grandparents lived in, Marianna, Pennsylvania, literally every immigrant community that was brought in is on a higher stripe of the hill. So, you start the mine with the Welsh and the Cornish and the English and the Scottish who maybe already live here or maybe come over and know something about mining. And then you need more people. Maybe they've died because the mine is unbelievably dangerous. And so then they're bringing in, now it's the Irish, now it's the Italian, now it's the Slavic. And to make more houses on a mining hill, you just keep building up. And then there's the African-American community, which is over in the east because, yes, they're segregated. And so the Russians are the last ones to arrive. And what that means is they're the most hated. Oh, we've been here longer. Oh, we know you interlopers. And they're the farthest from the mine. So geographically, they have sort of a better location. My great-grandparents' house was the reservoir was right behind them. They were on top of the hill. My great-aunt talks about going to pick mushrooms in the forest, which the Irish and the Italians are just, in the thick of it. The coke ovens, it smells terrible. So this is a completely real community. I've played with some time periods. And I gave this reading in Marianna, and I was invited to read there. Well, when the mines left, nothing replaced it. It is an incredibly depressed town. There's no bookstore. There's no cafe. You think about where are you going to read in Washington? Where are you going to, so many choices, so many festivals that are great. So Marianna, Pennsylvania, would you read at the library? Of course I would. I would love to. 350 people live there. So we get there and the librarian's a little bit put out because she has to stay open late, and she's put out some chairs and she's put out some cookies very kindly. 75 people came to this reading.
My gracious.
And I'm worried that they're going to say, like, you put the school here. It's not, because I'm trying to find things, but, history isn't about preserving depressed areas. And instead they're saying, you see us, you saw us. This is, oh my gosh. And they're also saying, you don't know me, but your great aunt took me in when I dropped out of West Virginia State. You don't know me, but your other great aunt lived right on the border of the Russian-Italian community. So we celebrated all the Russian holidays. You don't. And then one guy says, were your people the ones who rang the bells in church? Because I lived by the church.
And did he appreciate having the bells rung or not?
No, it rang a lot. But that feeling that's exactly why I wrote the book. I wrote the book because Toni Morrison says, if your people aren't on the shelf, you need to write that book, right? And so I had been looking for my people on the shelf, could not find them. And that, to go there and have them say, oh, you captured us. I need to buy a book for the mayor. I need to buy a book for it was so, and just exactly why you write that kind of book.
Well, congratulations on that. I mean, that is exactly the moment you want. Yeah. But the tricky part is fictionalizing reality, isn't it, as a craftsperson?
I've not written historical novels before. This is my fourth novel, and I love to make things up. And the crazier, the better. I mean, that people would say to me, like, why don't you just describe how two people have a conversation at the breakfast table? And I was like, pshaw. I want people to hang upside down and fly. I mean, this is fiction. Why, and animation was very important to me because, again, you could do anything you want. So this was really hard. I felt incredibly restricted. And Teddy Roosevelt is president when he's president. You can't change that. And the mind exists where it is. And this religion is this religion. And my cousin is the priest right now. So you're not going to, I wasn't out to diss anyone. But I was out to recognize the absurdities in the incredibly strict religion that has an odd set of rules. You may not smoke because your body is a temple, but you could drink. Just don't drink to excess. Just all of these things. So anyway, I felt very constrained. And also they're immigrants whose English is not their first language. Yelena is speaking English from the get-go, but they're not educated. So what's your vocabulary? What's your and
the literacy rates, who's literate, who's not. You have the father, Gregor, who's not, but the mother is.
Yeah. So I felt very, very straitjacketed because I love to play. I love to play with language. And it wasn't until you just keep drilling down, let's look at the laws of the time. I mean, look at executive orders we've been reading recently. And there's this great, I used it in the book, there's this great literacy test that they gave enlistees for World War I. And about the literacy test, people know about the literacy test for like the civil rights voting movement and how crazily unfair they were. Well, this literacy test starts with, is coal black? Literally, that's like the second question. Is snow white? And instead of yes and no, it says no or yes. So that's the first like flip that you wouldn't expect if you weren't necessarily literate. But then it goes to things like, do milksops perpetuate violence or perpetrate violence in their community? And when I read this among a high school audience, they don't even know what milksops are, right? So those questions, as they get bizarre and absurd, are out to trick people, right? And then the religion, and then the fairy tales, and then so I really, more research yielded more leeway, which was surprising.
That's an important point. More research opens up because more specific information actually opens up greater possibilities as your mind begins to play with those.
Yeah, and you just find the absurdity. And like I was looking at the funnies in the comics in the paper that Yelena might read because she's an early reader. So people are bringing her the paper. She doesn't want the funnies. She wants the newspaper. But she's a kid, so they bring her the comics. Well, the comics of those times are literally Rube Goldberg. He had a comic strip, and he uses ridiculous language. and Windsor McKay, and just ridiculous language, and people really being sassy. She's not allowed to be sassy. So it's a joy to read those things, and it's an outlet. So that was the research, not showing your research in a historical novel, that's a real challenge. As one of my early readers said, people in historical novels don't know they're in historical novels. Oh, darn it. Because you're really trying to just live the day, right? And not say, the fabric was made out of you're just put on the sweater and take the day. Oh, the sweater that her mother made from the old sweaters, unweaving them, that's a detail you can use, as opposed to what's the fabric content. So that was really challenging. And yet more research also opened up things.
You have a mine disaster, and it mirrors something that really happened.
It did really happen, yes.
Yeah.
Same here.
And I think, in fact, you soften the toll a bit. I mean, when I looked it up in the history books, I think there were more people killed than you have.
I thought I used the right data, but you might be looking at that year, which was a terrible, terrible year.
And that's right. I might be looking not at the same one, but yeah.
Because I was relying heavily on that history. So Teddy Roosevelt comes and proclaims them, the safest, most modern mine in America, and then the whole thing just falls to pieces. And I was so naive about not mining disasters. I actually thought they didn't necessarily know what caused them. That's how naive I was. And then you again do the research, and my grandfather had talked to me about mining. I mean, he told me that the explosives for the mine came out of his salary. The pick came out of his salary. So they're in there underground with very low ceilings, because it costs time to shore up the ceilings, and time is coal and money. And they're hacking away at the rock, which releases coal dust and methane, but they're also setting explosions underground with coal dust and methane, and they have a live flame on their heads. So, things are constantly blowing up or falling in or poisoning them. The methane is deadly. So, I foolishly thought, oh, they really didn't know. But in fact, you have an accident. What do? You send for more people, like a cord of wood.
And you have in the novel that one widow, the widows are then evicted from the company housing.
Why should they be in company housing? They're not minors.
And one widow gets $300 because her husband had worked there for a while, and one widow gets $50 because her husband had only worked there for a month.
And she's 15 years old.
And she's 15 years old.
And she's just arrived in America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is why I think it's important that we all understand that this is based on reality, that yes, this is fiction, but you anchored this in something that really happened.
And when you started with the dedication, which I love that you did that, people at every single reading have this urgency. I have to tell you about my grandmother. And I don't know if grandfathers don't tell their stories because it happened a lot to them, but it's really people saying, just grabbing you by the lapel. I have to, an urgency. And I say, if your grandmother is alive, if your mother is alive, if your aunt is alive, go home, call them, have them tell the story, record it on your phone, get it in writing, let's start collecting these. And that's been one of the amazing things. My other books are wildly, imaginatively odd. And when I go to book clubs or readings or events, a lot of people say, yeah. What an imagination. They kind of shake their head and take it in. And this book, everybody's got a story. Oh my God, African American, Native American, Italian, Jewish. Everybody's got some sort of Armenian. Oh, and then they married, what is outside your circle, right? They married, the Italian Catholic marries the Polish Catholic, and both sets of families disown each other. They're both Catholic, So a lot of those rivalries, I call it like Michigan versus Michigan State. In my book, the Polish and the Russian are so close in beliefs, and where they came from and their traditions, and they just despise each other.
Well, and this is true of the old believers, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
the difference between them and, this is Russian Orthodox, but the differences are very minor. It's like how you hold your hand when you cross yourself, kind of that
Yeah.
level of difference.
This is Russian Orthodox. This is Catholic, and oh my gosh, the fights and the martyrs and how you hold your finger and yeah. How many, what the cross looks like. The Russian Orthodox cross has extra bars at the top and the bottom and why they're there. And I mean, people went to their deaths because of that. So the Russian Orthodox, the old believers specifically, were terribly persecuted in the old country. All the priests were killed at one point. And like the Amish here or the Shakers, the Quakers were persecuted. The Amish and the Shakers weren't as much, but they wore their evidence of their religion. The men had long beards and the clothing they wore, and the women didn't cut their hair. You could tell who they were. So they were very obvious, and they were extremely rebellious. They were not going to change a word of their church for anybody, not Peter the Great or anyone else. And so they were incredibly punished. And so the Jews were treated horribly. And I would right next to that were the old believers.
And this in Europe where they were, this made them vulnerable to recruiting by the coal company who recruited them to come over.
Who literally put flyers up on the town square. Come on over. House, job, free ticket. Okay. There's no food where they are. So my people are peasants. They're not well educated. And consequently, that's another reason they're not on the bookshelf. But then also something you talked about earlier that I really want to make a point of is where you start the story. If it starts in the old country before Yelena's born, she can't be our narrator, or unless she's heard the story from them. And so starting it where I started it and choosing first person, I also had never written a novel in the first person before. And earlier I had published several books with Farrar Straus Giroux, and my editor there of 20 years said, when he read this draft, he said, I don't want this book from you. And I was just shocked. I mean, we had a good run there. We had a good 3-novel run. And he also said, I don't think it should be first person, and he said, look at your Willa Cather, look at your My Antonia. I was like, you look at your My Antonia. This has to be first person, because the whole point of the book is I am here and you don't see me. So if it's third person, it sounds like a National Geographic special. Oh, these quaint people and their habits, and, look how they worship and how they cross themselves. And she has to be in it.
And I agree with you. I mean, I can't conceive of this book being anywhere else but located within the center of our narrator. And we look out at the world from inside her. And I think that may be why I was so captivated by the novel when I first heard you read from it.
And so that's also about voice. Several of my friends write YA, and they said, oh, it sounds like you're writing a YA novel. And I mean, we talk about this all the time. What's the difference between what is To Kill a Mockingbird? What is Catcher in the Rye, right? It's fabulous novels in the first person, and voice being so important in both of those books. And I kept saying, no, I'm not writing a YA novel. Now that it's done, I feel like, oh, it's for every age. There's nothing in it. I mean, there's death, there's sadness, but there's nothing in it that I wouldn't let any age read. I was writing it for a literary audience, and there's a lot of adult content, but it's not violent or pornographic, or there's family abuse. There's a lot of terrible things that happen to them.
Well, there is that the mother and father having their knockdown, drag out fight, and then a baby 9 months later.
Yes, that's a whole nother topic of Yelena imagining how babies are made. All she sees is that somebody has a drunken knockdown, drag out fight, and 9 months later a baby is born. So she's, putting her own cause and correlation together. Yeah.
Perceptions of cause and effect.
Yeah. And so that was another challenge, like the citizenship piece. Yelena identifies as an American, And in 1907, Teddy Roosevelt signed a law that said women, only women who married foreigners, lost their American citizenship. And that is seeded through the book. And yet people say, I was so surprised. I was so surprised by the ending. It's all there. And yet what the reader knows versus being in Yelena's head, what she has chosen to accept or not accept, you have to try to play both. I know how babies are made, but Yelena imagines it a different way. So you have to make that believable.
And that's one of the craft elements, isn't it? That you count on the reader standing in a world apart from the book, but entering that book of your imagination and seeing it through Yelena's eyes and being able to come back and forth and vibrate, if you will, between the real world and the world of your imagination. And that's, if you can do that, you can write anything. But the other thing, to your point about that law in 1907, that was before women had to vote.
Yes.
And that's what saves them, is when they get the vote, they are able to make some changes that are more beneficial.
In fact, it's even more than that, because what saves them is a woman is elected in, I think, Wyoming. I might have the state wrong. And her opponent says, this is before or as women are getting the vote, and her opponent says she's not a citizen because her first husband was a Brit. And what? So then they have to go back and take a look at that law. Yeah. So she's already remarried an American, but he claims she's not even a citizen, so she can't be the senator or the congressperson or what, and that's what leads to the change of the law. When the law is changed, women do not receive their citizenship again. They are allowed to apply to be naturalized if their husband has become a citizen.
And we think today is complicated.
It is complicated. And I'll just interrupt you there, because this has been another amazing repercussion of talking about a book that 100 years ago is asking who gets to be an American citizen and how capricious it is, and watching someone really struggle and be wedded to this country and then have it taken away for ridiculous reasons. And so I'm writing that, and there's a scene in the book where there's been so many mining accidents, and World War I is raging, and a lot of the men are thinking, maybe I'll go enlist. Turns out they can't, because Wilson says, you're essential workers. We need coal. And they're just trying to figure out, how are we ever going to get out of here alive? If we leave, having been brought here by the coal company, who do we belong to? They're not citizens. Are they allowed to leave? They're not technically indentured servants, but you owe money. You owe money for your everything. It's hard to get a salary because you don't even get money. You get chits to spend in their store. So you don't have savings. And I'm typing that, and instead of 1919, I typed 2019. And I jumped back from the keyboard, because so much of it was exactly what was going on. The coda to this story is, I got invited to speak to a high school in Delaware. If you looked at this class, you would just say high school kids. You wouldn't demographize them and say, oh, I get who these people are. They're just a bunch of kids of every description. And the teacher said, give them a writing prompt. Okay, write your American ending. So I'm expecting, I win the lottery and I'm a millionaire. So tables, pick somebody at each table to volunteer to read theirs. First kid, very shy Black kid. Go on, Daniel, go on. His American ending is, I want to live a long life and die of natural causes. That's the first one out of the gate. Second one is, I want to be allowed to stay in this country as an American-born child, but not have my parents deported back to Haiti. Oh, no. We were just gutted.
And when was this?
This was right when the book came out, September 2023. And then one kid said, get this, my American ending is to go back to Guatemala and live a simpler life. That's a very complicated American ending.
Well, and this bears some discussion. The title of the book is American Ending, but if you haven't read the book, you don't know what that contrasts with. It contrasts with Russian Ending, as the book says in.
Can I read that paragraph?
Yes, go right ahead.
Okay, because a lot of people say, "Why is it called that? Why is it called that?" And just like the first paragraph wasn't my first paragraph, this wasn't my title. This is the second page of the book. Each night, Ma uncoiled her braided bun and dropped hairpins in her lacquered box, painted with Emilian and his magic pike. She shook out her golden plates, never cut because that was a sin, and carried them like the train of a dress into our room, letting go so she could hoist our stack of covers. She tucked the heavy wool blanket beneath our chinny chin chins and perched on our bed, careful not to sit on her hair. Rubbing her swelling belly, she asked, "Russian ending or American ending?" So it's that in her mind, the happy ending, those Americans, or the sad Russian ending. But that refrain haunts Yelena. Russian ending or American ending? You're brought over here by a coal company. You've got a warm place to sleep and food for your children. And then the mine blows up and the father is killed. Russian ending or American ending?
That's the Russian ending.
In America.
But it's in America.
So that's what she's constantly like going over in her head.
But the classic American ending is in the fairy tale sort of motif. The prince rushes, the prince rushes in, slays the dragon, cuts him open, and the princess is unharmed and released from the belly of the dragon.
Yeah, so you're already mixing fairy tale and American ending. American ending is work hard, get ahead, children do better than you do, and maybe. But it was interesting because the day that Blair is the publisher that bought my book. It's an independent publisher in North Carolina. Love them. Love the work they do. They were fantastic. And they said, I called the book Yelena. They said, we think it should have a different title. We're going to send it to a committee. Oh boy, committee. And then they called and said, we think it should be called American Ending. I said, of course it should be. I don't even have to re-engineer the book. Of course it should be called American Ending. Even though a lot of books have American as their first word, And then I went out to dinner that night with a bunch of writers, and I said, "Here's the new title of the book." And right away, everybody's riffing. American ending, because it could be sincere, it could be sarcastic, ironic. Whereas if I say Russian ending, you only think dour. Nobody says Russian ending, and we all celebrate, and everyone's healthy, and the boy gets the girl. But American ending has a million different ramifications. And the rest of that dinner, people would tell a story, and it didn't matter what it was about. Then they go, American ending. Am I right? Am I right?
So when we bumped into each other back this fall, you mentioned, and I've looked on your website, you're trying to contact a reader group in every state and foster discussion, which I think is why I said I want to talk about this. So let's pivot to that a little bit. How's that going? What's your motive? How's it going?
My motive is, you know this better than anyone. It turns out you are responsible for your own publicity. It doesn't matter if you have a publicist or the best publisher in the world. You are responsible for your own book's publicity. So fourth book in, I accept that. Or the world has changed such that that is the case. And you're looking for book-related organic manifestations that it makes sense to show your book. I'm not going to read in a candy store, but I am going to, I just was invited to read at the Icon Museum in Massachusetts. Perfect. This book has a whole bunch of Russian icons, and icons are very important. So that makes sense. So as people were saying to me, I have to tell you my story. I was just talking in my book club, and she said, and I thought, you know what? This is the perfect book for book clubs because of this the food, the stories, the atmosphere, the nostalgia, but also the struggle. And American Ending across America. Here's a story of mining in Colorado. Here's a story of mining in Montana. Okay, forget mining. Here's a story about textile mills. Like people have a million different connections to this book. And one of the threads that I kept hearing was there's absolutely no shame in my grandparents' story or my great-grandparents' story who came over and when. There's no shame in that. But they were made to feel shame here. They lost their Russian as soon as they possibly could. I heard my grandmother say, better to speak broken English than Russian. And the church has a whole different language. They speak in Slavonic. That was also lost in a generation. And how they dressed and what they ate, they were really made to feel shame. In our generation, there's no shame in their story. And that story wasn't even told for a long time. But many people said to me, before my grandmother died, before my grandfather got sick, he said, I have to tell you what really happened. I have to tell you. And so this notion of American Ending across America has been just, I kind of wish I had been transcribing all people's stories, because sit down with 8 people and what comes up. And can I tell you one remarkable one?
Please do.
I was invited to do a Zoom with a book club in Naples, Italy, of a military family. So I think it was all women. Maybe there was a man or two there, but so 10 people who are in Naples because they or their spouse are serving in the military. And one woman says, I appreciated that you dealt with family abuse, domestic abuse, because, she said, I was beaten by my father. And this is not about me, she said, but I appreciated reading about it in a novel and how Yelena was impacted. And then she just immediately changed the subject and the group went on. And then I said, I just want to go back a minute to what she said. And I want to say, I'm sorry that happened to you. And this is a terrible problem. And in this community where there's a lot of drinking and such strict rules and people are married off, young and have a lot of kids, I said, there are many men in my family who actually took themselves out of the family because of the physical abuse. And I wanted to address that. So afterwards, the person who had invited me to the book club sent me this long email and said, I've been in Naples, but we've not really shared personal stories. We've been spouses and wives. And some of the people were people who were actually serving. And she said, and that discussion opened us up. And we sat there for an hour telling extremely personal stories. And now we're more than a book club. It's like, why do you write a book?
Yeah. I mean, that is what I do refer to as the community of people who share an experience through reading. I mean, it starts with that, right? It starts with reading. It starts with sharing the experience of reading, and then it opens things up, and it builds empathy. It builds the understanding and the knowledge.
And the first person aspect, the second you go third person in a story like this, you add that weird veil of judgment, like, oh, look at them behaving that way, and look at this weird religion, or a weird, for me, the 21st century veil of feminism, which I am the strongest feminist in the world, so I am not in any way, but it doesn't fit for 1908. And so every time I would do that scrim, it would be, how dare they behave this way? I was like, I can't, that's not a historical novel to have my attitudes imposed on that. The historical novel is, oh my God, this is how I go to school in the morning. And also the joy. I mean, many people said to me, my favorite scene is their Thanksgiving, which is just like the stone soup story. Oh, I've got some poppy seeds. I've got some, yay, we can make poppy seed rolls, So they all pull together and Kostya, the brother, figures out a way to trap turkeys and they have this Thanksgiving. And And it's a rare break from the drudgery that they mostly have to deal with. But that's what you do. You have good times and bad. And part of the wonder of immigrant communities is that tribal togetherness, that yes, we can celebrate this together, grief and joy. And the religion brings that.
Well, and I think that's where the title is so appropriate, right? American Indian. And it's not just, we're all immigrants at some level, some number of generations removed from that, unless we are Native Americans.
We need to admit that more and more and more. As I was writing this book, Jennifer Mendelsohn has this, I forgot what it's called, but she has a genealogy project. Maybe it's called Resistance Genealogy, where during the first Trump administration, every time somebody like Stephen Miller would say something horrible against immigrants or talking about restricting them, she would look into that person's genealogy and discover, oh, guess what? Chain immigrant? Yeah, that's how his grandfather got here. Donald Trump's just a perfect example. His mother was an immigrant. She was born in Scotland. He has married 2 out of 3 of his wives were immigrants. And were not citizens when the kids were born. Oh, interesting. So this weird habit we have in America of talking about aspirationally who we are as a nation, ignoring who we really are as a nation, is confusing, and it's false.
Yeah. Now, that raises a point. Down here on the coast of North Carolina, from which I'm recording this at the moment, people who voted for Trump say, well, they're not opposed to immigration. They just want it to be legal.
Oh, I love this. Here's my favorite within my own family. Our family did it the right way. And why can't people do that? And the right way, first of all, indentured servitude. But secondly, those who were not brought over by the coal company, there were no immigration laws then. You arrived, it's right before Ellis Island, so they're arriving into Baltimore, and they are recorded. That is how you arrived. And then you go through the steps to try to become a citizen if you're interested. So
otherwise you go out there and try to make a life for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So this notion of, we did it the right way. It's like we just walked in and that was allowed at that time. So let's not pretend that we looked into all the laws and said, yes, in fact, we are welcome if these following conditions are met. That's not how it worked. Yeah. And then, of course, you meet people who have done every single possible right thing and are being nabbed or denied. Yeah. Those stories are so heartbreaking.
From your research, can you project and tell us what happened to the family you've written about? You mentioned that the coal company eventually gave up that particular mine. Did they just mine it out and then they moved on, or what was the trajectory?
Yeah. So in my own family, the goal was to get the hell out of there before you're killed.
A noble ambition.
Yeah. So on my mom's side, my grandmother and grandfather get to Detroit. Detroit, huge, Black migration, all sorts of migration, huge factories and industry. So in fact, they get to Detroit, they marry there, have my uncle, and then Detroit, Ford you didn't get a contract. You stood outside the factory, as my grandfather describes it, and they would say, today we're taking you. So it wasn't steady. And if the demand went down, we only took this many U's today. So he was out of work, and my great uncle said, oh, come back to the mines. So then they went to West Virginia, where my mother was born, in a different mining community near Morgantown. And she spent her first couple of years. So many of the things that happened to Yelena, my mother has coal embedded in her elbow from tripping on the hill as she ran to see her grandfather one day. And then where do you go? Well, if you're this part of this incredibly strict religion, where is there a church? There was a church in Detroit. There's a church in Erie. Again, Erie was a huge industrial town. Pittsburgh was too, but there wasn't a church in Pittsburgh. Mariana was the closest church to Pittsburgh. So then my grandparents got to Erie, where my parents both grew up in Erie. So my two grandmothers and grandfathers lived 5 blocks apart. And my dad's mom and dad, my dad's mother was married off at 14, and she had her first kid at 15. And she had a child every 2 years, except for the year she had identical twins. And my dad is her 11th, the last kid. My father was the last child of them. So we would go from 5th and Parade, where my mom's parents lived, walking down to 1st and Parade to go to church. But 1st and Parade is also where my dad's parents lived. And in those 4 blocks, 4 of his 7 sisters lived. So I grew up in Oklahoma. Go figure. But we would go back to Erie all the time, and that's where my parents grew up. So they all got out of the mines and worked for GE, worked for paper mills, so Erie had a lot of industry and the church. You want to live near the church if you are observant. But my great aunt Pearl, who was in West Virginia in the mines, they lived in the Cassville until the mine closed. So mining becomes, as you know, more and more expensive. And what if there's regulations that you have to clean up behind you? Well, we're not going to pay that. We'll just go dig through we'll just blow up a different mountain. Yeah. So a lot of mines were abandoned or weren't so profitable or caved in or flooded.
And just didn't get resurrected.
Right. It wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth saving it. We've mined it out. We've tapped it out. I've had some really interesting connections to people who find you because of the book. And one scholar is just going to mining town after mining town. And can you show me what's left of the coke ovens? Can you show me what's left? And then also, while I was writing the book one day, my daughter-in-law is a map librarian at the Library of Congress. My husband's a genealogist. So one day, like within 2 days, all the 3 of us triangulate this map that's at the top of my website. The map of the mine, the actual mine in Mariana, the shaft that my grandfather went down, of the era. And you see this whole city dug underground by men, mules, explosives, and pickaxes with railroad cars and water and streets. And it's a whole city that they dug. It's just phenomenal. And it's down there still, unless it's caved in.
Is it anything happening there? Is it just sitting?
No. And it cordoned off because you hear about children fall down a well or children fall down a mine shaft. Yeah. No, it's horribly dangerous. So there are mine museums where you can ride the coal car underground and see what on earth it was like. And I've done some of that. I forgot what your question was.
That's okay. This is a great conversation in terms of that. You've ridden the coal car down into the pit, so to speak?
Yeah. Near Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, there's a mining museum. And you go down into the mine and see the temperature differential and how darn dark it is down there. And it smells like a grave. And they just show you what a day in the life was like.
Is this a concession you pay for?
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm laughing, except that it just seems, I don't know, in a sense, so American.
Yeah. And also, tell this to your writers. I mean, I did so much Google research and book research. And then the day that I read in the Mariana library, I had been to Mariana, but I hadn't been to the library. And it never occurred to me that, of course, all of their information would not be online. They don't have those kind of facilities. And you walk into the Mariana library and they have glass cases with books, also had miners' hats, the chits that they got, the tag that was your number we put on your coal bucket, the lunch trays that are one layer after another. There they all were. And I'd seen them in museums, but I thought, of course I should have been hanging out at the library, and people's histories were on their shelves. So tell all your students and your writers to go to not just the scene of the crime, but go to the library at the scene of the crime.
We kind of circled around this, but I want to come back to the idea of conflict because I think a lot of writers, particularly coming up writers, but I think even people who've done a couple of books, and particularly working on short stories, have issues of how to create conflict, particularly when they're embedded in a story, as you were with this one, like you're saying, it's your family, it's your history, and they don't see the conflict. How do you see conflict and invest it in the work so that the reader feels pulled along by it?
Yeah, that was a challenge for me. And I I do developmental editing, which is reading people's drafts and helping them shape it. So I'm not line editing, but I'm saying, let's talk about conflict, character, dialogue, setting, and trying to really bring the book up out so that it is as vivid as they imagine it in their head. And at the exact same time that I was struggling with this, I was reading someone else's book, and it was about a young girl, and she was 3 and then she was 5. And I was like, oh my God, I did the same thing. That's not a novel. And then, that's not a novel. And also, even though I kept putting what the year was, people said, I have a hard time keeping track of how old she is. I was like, I have every year and date in there. But if you instead cluster around, oh my God, the year she turned 13, something changed, something horrible happened, right? Or something wonderful happened, or the potential for something, then I'm following it before she was 13. And when she turned 13, so you're organizing it around the central conflict. And I taught a class at George Mason on writing a novel in a semester. It was an amazing class. I did it too. We wrote 4,000 words a week for 10 weeks and then shared things. And as we did that, we read 5 novels under 50,000 words and 5 books on craft. It was like running a marathon every week, and it was astonishing. But the things I learned about how a novel is put together that goes with what you're saying, my pet peeve in a workshop is someone will say, I don't really know what's happening in this story. I don't really understand the character. Maybe you're writing a novel. That's not a novel. When we opened these books, and we opened them to whatever our word count was, to see what Jane Smiley had going on in 4,000 words and to see what Fitzgerald had going on at 8,000 words, you can't believe a first page. I know exactly what the conflict is here. It is right up front. And then the other thing I learned that is amazing to me is that if you open a book to the exact middle page, you don't draft it this way, but as you recraft it and that is the page on which afterwards nothing can be the same. So people think that's the ending. And the ending is that may that be that way too. But in the very middle, something happens. So in Great Gatsby, on the middle page, Gatsby says to Nick, will you invite Daisy over to tea at your house? Okay, here we go. Now, opening middle page of To Kill a Mockingbird, he takes the trial. Atticus takes the trial. So that's, so what's the middle page of my book? I'm not going to tell you because I'm hoping people will read it. But that was a revelation to me. And when I teach the novel, I say to people, let's write your middle page. What changes such that nothing can be the same? It's not all resolved. It's like, and then she realized that he'd been lying to her. And then he realized, that the baby wasn't going to make it. And then they realized, so something changes for the second half of the book.
Well, shouldn't that also apply to short stories? I mean, isn't there that pivotal point in a short story where nothing can go back?
Short stories, you start as, what is it? Somebody said this, William Maxwell, you start as close to the ending as you possibly can.
Right.
And boy, do we have a hard time doing that. And same with novels. I've just read a draft of a novel of a friend of mine, and it's 400 pages, and the first 150 are just getting the lay of the land and recognizing all the amazing research that was done, but that there's no conflict. And so it's really the person sort of figuring out the story, which that's not going to be in the final novel, but it is in the first draft. We're still figuring the story out, and it shouldn't be in the final draft of your short story either. But short stories and novels are quite different. A short story is, in my opinion, one arrow shot at a target. And a novel is a quiver of arrows. And you realize as you are thinking about it, shouldn't be obvious as you're reading it, that every single one of those arrows, every subplot is the plot. And they cluster around that target in a satisfying way so that you see the target. But that a short story is much more direct.
Right. Maybe we should stop it there. Although I'm reluctant to do that. This has been so much fun and such a good chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me. And I'm still looking for, I've got 26 states. So my American Ending Across America, I have said, I'll show up if I can, but Zoom, we all know how to Zoom now. And so I have Zoomed to Alaska, to Naples, Italy, to London. I've gone to London, too, to talk about this book. But I have Zoomed all over, and that's how it started. Somebody in Alaska said, would you talk to my book club? I said, of course I will. And then I thought, I already have Alaska. How hard can the other 49 states be? So I still need half of them. And, if someone's in another state and they would like me to Zoom with their book club, I'm happy to do it. I mean, I think that this effort to talk about immigration 100 years ago and now is extremely valuable right now.
Agreed. So how does somebody reach you to do that?
Through my website. That's easy, theamericanending.net. That's easy. There's a place to click. Yeah.
Theamericanending.net.
It's not just americanending.net.
Americanending.net. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Cool.
you. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching Upstart Crow. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and explore more conversations with writers, artists, and literary voices from our archive. You can also listen to Upstart Crow on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit upstartcrow.org for more information about our episodes, guests, our hosts, and ways you can support the podcast. Thank you again for joining us on Upstart Crow, a part of Watershed Lit Radio.